Now, if you see a push button on an existing traffic signal pole, based on the foundation size, you're probably already exceeding that 10-inch maximum from the face to where your landing might extend to. One option is to move the pole. Another one is to create a pedestal and put that on. Probably the better option is to get one of these adapting extensions. There we go. You can install that and put the button in the face, extend it out away from the pole. Probably the cheaper way to alleviate that source of non-compliance.
All right, let's talk construction. So there is going to be a separate construction class. Oh, I guess I got to bring up the slides for that. You want to do that for me? There is going to be a separate construction class. I guess before I even get into the slides, I wanted to offer my 2 cents on best practices for construction. First off, we already talked from the standard plan. We're given the direction to cast the landing separately. A lot of times we are designing in the field and just trying to make grades work. Sometimes, even if we are given elevations or spline grades in the gutters, they don't work. So figuring out where the landing needs to be and making sure it's placed separately will help with a lot of potential problems. Watch the gutter grades and slopes. Remember that the gutter has to be maintained at a 2% max cross slope flowing perpendicular to your pedestrian access route. That could be something that requires some warping or special finishing. Watch removals to make sure the contractor has pulled out enough panels to make the grades work. Also, so that you don't get some weird funky tenting stuff happening. So when a contractor is on a project, depending on how it's bid, sorry to pick on Met Council, but they do everything lump sum, drives me crazy because pedestrian access ramp, lump sum. That drives me crazy as the inspector because he's trying to minimize the number of panels he removes, right? He's getting paid for each one, no offense really. But if they're paid for concrete removal, they know that if they're going to get paid for another panel, they're going to get asked to remove another panel, they're going to get paid to remove another panel, right? So being thoughtful, this goes right back to what David said about culture change. If we think of how we can put together the quantity list to encourage the contractor to be more easy to work with out on the job, things like paying them for removals and replacement is something that's helpful. Paying for an access ramp by the lump sum means he's going to try to minimize his work on that ramp, right? So again, I don't mean to call out, I think, how does MnDOT pay for these? Is it by removals and replacement?
Depends on the project.
Depends on the project. Okay, so like I said, if you pay for removals and then concrete by the yard, you have more latitude because you can say, hey, just work with me, take out those 2 panels, you're going to get paid for it, right? And if you've done some surveying, you know that a few more panels is going to yield a better project. So that's me, not anybody else talking, but just me, okay?
At the same point, though, the contractor's bidding that should be looking as to what they're bidding, and that's lump sum. I'm not going to get paid for one. Well, I'm going to jack my price up a little bit more because I'm going to make it up on the end. A smart estimator would be thinking ahead.
I love that you're giving them credit for that.
I'm not. I'm just
no, a smart estimator would do that.
Something like that.
Right. I mean, I just mean that as an inspector or the engineer on the job, it's so nice when I have a unit that I can pay for when I ask a contractor to do more work. I mean, I totally hear what you're saying.
From my side, being inspector and construction manager, I love lump sum because you know what? I don't have to keep track of the quantities or anything. It's lump sum. You're going to get paid, boom. You do it, and that's what I appreciate getting for.
Well, we could differ on that. I don't like lump sum items. Lump sum is easier as an inspector because you see it done, you pay lump sum. But I'm just saying there are some ways to get, to give me a little bit more power out on the job, right? So we could argue about this, or not argue, we could discuss this. I'm just saying that there's ways to give your inspectors a little bit more power out in the field. Regardless, it's still up to him to make the grades work, right? So if he does a removal and you're looking at it, you're like, oh, I'm not sure that's gonna work. I always keep a level in my car. I always will shoot it. Not always. If I trust the contractor and it looks okay, I won't shoot it. But a lot of times you cannot get a decision with a 4-foot level. If they're removing a couple panels, you may need to actually survey it. So that's what I'm saying. Watch your jointing. I think some other people agreed with me that you think the contractor's gonna joint it a certain way. You leave and go check on the next ramp, come back, and he's got it sawed some weird way. Once it's sawed, you don't have much control. So if that's an issue for you, talk to the contractor ahead of time and make sure you're on the same page. Check elevations. Again, I always keep a level. Even though Met Council doesn't require me to do that, before we shoot a curb ramp, I'll take shots and make sure everything is going to grade. Again, with this, we just see direction, but we don't get an overall idea. Somebody said it takes 2 seconds to take a shot. Who said that? It's really true. It takes 2 seconds once you have a rod up. You don't even need to shoot to a benchmark. You're just looking at change in elevation. So I guess you do get a feel when you're out on a job site as to what kind of contractor you're working with and if they're doing good work. But for me, doing a spot check is always worth the time. Okay, so we're going to go through these and then we'll hand it back over to Brady. The things that we're going to talk about are what we've already covered: pedestrian curb ramps, driveway and sidewalk construction. We already talked about on the MnDOT standard plans, and on your own plans, you'll see steep grades and flat grades. You'll also see location of the landing indicated as a hatch. Remember, from the standard plans, landings are going to be required at the top of any steep grades and anywhere that you have a change in direction. We already talked about this before, and I just already mentioned it, that these joints could be done better. If you saw this picture, you would see that these joints actually, the contractor laid out the joints nicely in this direction and this direction. When you get into this little radius area, that becomes a little bit trickier. Again, this dimension and layout is going to be based on your back of curb radius, so we can't say specifically, but MnDOT likes us to have this joint coming out like here. We'd have a joint here, we'd have a joint here, etc.
It looks like they just followed their curb lines and extended their sidewalk joints and extended them on through on that.
Yeah, they did. What you're left here is this little triangular piece. I don't like that. I mean, every curb is different. All we're saying is make sure that you go through the jointing layout with the contractor. What do you think, right or wrong? Should be saying wrong. It's wrong, right? Because we already talked about it. Actually, I thought we had already seen this picture. I had seen it just 6 other times, not today. So this is that section where we're supposed to place this integral with curb and gutter. And this panel should be placed transversely here when we get the first full width section. Here's a great example of how we're on a skew. So every curb intersection is different. This does not match up with the standard plate because we have a funny return radius here, but we are indicating this would be a good place for you to have your joint go across here. Landing construction, again, to ensure that your initial ramps and landings are properly constructed, they should be cast separately. Here's that little piece of Winona curb placed with the gutter. Landing construction, sheet 6 of 6 shows your reinforcement details. Here's for a square landing and for a radial landing. Look at, here's a casting right in the middle of the landing. I would say that's okay, right? As long as it has the right cover?
Well, it could be, might not do a good job of being. Or any problem.
It has a tolerance, but it might not be slip resistant if it gets wet. So do everything you can to get it out of the par.
But look at here, we got this concrete wall, and that's just further illustration that we got all kinds of weird stuff out there, right? All right, so here is MnDOT's, these are MnDOT slides. As best Brady and I can decipher from this is showing the layout for a for a pedestrian curb ramp in the field. So we start with our gutter. From the gutter, we know that the maximum slope can be 5 to 8.33. As you'll see from the next slide, MnDOT gives us a starting point. So this is coming. I'm going to back up here. MnDOT tells us that when you're designing these in the field, we start with 7%. That gives us yet a 1.33 on the high side if this doesn't work, and we're well within that, we're well within the maximum. So start with 7% on laying out that first landing. So on a steep slope, we're able to go from 5 to 8.3. MnDOT says start with 7%. On a flat slope, we're able to go 2 to 5, start at 4. On a landing, no more than 2, start at 1.5. Sidewalk cross slope, no more than 2, also start at 1.5. And on a fan ramp, we go 2 to 5. So again, we start at the gutter grade. Again, don't leave this up to chance. You're going to need to know what the gutter is going to be through there so that you don't create a problem for yourself. 7% up to that first landing. Then start to take a look at what is coming throughout to match up to your adjacent grades. This is a pretty high elevation change. There's a railroad track back there. Then if you need another ramp, we have another landing here to accommodate a change in direction, and then a flat slope out through here. So doing some of these initial layouts through construction, starting at the gutter and working your way up is what they're proposing. Remembering that what the contractor lays out is great as long as he doesn't exceed tolerances in a way that impact your cross slope. So what I said before, if he's got, let's say, a 2% maximum cross slope on a landing, but he digs out the middle, so now with a 2-foot level, it's steeper than 2%, that's a problem. He may be within the 1/4 inch tolerance, but he is not within the 2% maximum slope. Use steep and flat slopes together to help you match into existing conditions. When placing curb, check the plan for secondary landings and adjust the top of curb to match landing grades. We already talked about that. You may also need to check other areas where you're matching in, like at doors, stairs, etc. Here's your maximum and preferred slopes through the cross slope. So in a ramp, the cross slope has a maximum of 2%. The minimum is 0.5%. In the gutter, what I'm proceeding this slide to say is as long as you get positive flow through the gutter, they're not calling out a minimum. 0 would not mean you have positive flow. So anything greater than that, which allows for positive flow but no more than 2%. V-curve, this is the detail that I showed you on the last page of the standard plan. Just calling out for bond breaker between V-curve and any adjacent buildings. Removal limits, I mentioned this before that I always check removals on a job to make sure he's pulled out enough. Make sure you don't get any weird tenting situation. This is where you have 2% adverse grade coming in, and then you place a new curb, or I'm sorry, a new sidewalk in the opposite direction. You would want the contractor to pull out that panel and put in a landing. Here's a better slide of what that's showing. Again, landings are required if the approach sidewalk is inverse, also known as tenting. So you might have to remove 1 or even more panels to accommodate that flattening. All right, I haven't talked about this before, but you may have a situation where your existing cross slope on your sidewalk is greater than 2. Let's say it's 4. Who knows what it is? If you have existing existing cross slope on your sidewalk of, let's say, 4, and you're coming up to new construction, there has to be some accommodation for that change in the cross slope, right? Otherwise, you'll have a vertical face where the two come together. Clearly don't want a vertical face. This is the recommendation from MnDOT that change in cross slope, kind of like a super elevation transition, but here we're talking about the sidewalk cross slope, that happens at a rate of 0.5% per foot. So my example, going from -4 to -2, we're changing the cross slope 2%. Divided by 0.5, we need to accommodate that through a 4-foot panel. So additional panels may also be required for meeting adverse grades for meeting elevation slope requirements, but also for accommodating that transition in cross slope. So if a secondary landing is necessary, also see, this is just reinforcing that you may need one to accommodate cross slope transition. Last but not least, best practices, make sure that whatever you're putting in is not adversely impacting drainage down the gutter, right? So don't create these problems because you didn't think far enough beyond the crosswalk. I like this picture. It shows how this contractor has removed pretty far, I would consider that pretty far back, in order to match his grades through this intersection. Don't overlay the curb and gutter. And remember that the cross slope the gutter grade must be, maximized at 5%. So we have all kinds of adjustments in the gutter and in the pedestrian access ramps. In an intersection, might require quite a bit of design in the office, but well worth it when you get out into the field. The maximum rollover, I call this like the inverse grade or the adverse, it's like the opposite of rollover on super elevation. The maximum is 13%. So if you have an adjacent ramp at 8.33, this gutter is going to have to be warped up to less than 5. It's got to be warped up to less than 4.66, so that that delta A, like on a vertical curve, or that A or delta G would be maximized at 13. Note 3, I already showed you this for curb machine placement. Start the transition 10 feet outside of your gutter ramps. Outside your gutter ramps, outside your curb openings. I'm sorry, I better read my slides. All right, here's that Winona curb that we talked about already. Remembering that you can change your gutter grade through here if you have a skewed condition in your gutter. You're allowed to go up to 3%. The next few slides just have to do with mill and overlay. Just acknowledging the fact that when you're dealing with a mill and overlay, you really have limited elevation change to work with. You have limited transverse distance to work with, and it just becomes even more challenging. So tabling or maintaining the cross slope throughout an intersection just means that raising all the grades up and doing some kind of warping could be required. You may have to push the cross slope on your gutter outside of your curb opening so that you maintain this 2% maximum through the intersection. Anytime you have a constrained intersection, like where you have a doorway or you have other things that are controlling your elevation, you may also have to kind of work with this. This is showing a very constricted situation where we don't have many removals. You have to worry about longitudinal grades and cross slopes in many directions. This is a funny picture showing that there's this huge change in grade through here where we're bringing in a mill and overlay at something that's significantly greater than this gutter grade. So it's hard to see here, but that's like a 4-inch change there. So that would be a hump through here that would be unacceptable. At the bottom of a ramp like this, we put a contraction joint at the bottom. In special situations, we may have to try and match the existing roadway to the maximum feasible extent or maximum extent feasible. Anybody in here who's been a designer knows that sometimes you just don't have a lot of vertical difference to work with, and we do our best. Other special considerations might happen, like I showed before, where you have an entrance to a building that's very close. You might have a retaining wall or something else that really limits your design space. Remember that these truncated domes do not communicate directionality, so we don't put them like this. We put them transverse to warn the user that they're coming up to an intersection. Here's that standard plate, 7038A, which shows the different sizes of radial detectable domes. So detectable domes are available in all different radii, from 10 up to 35. Going through the process that Brady showed may allow you to use a rectangular placement as long as back of curb distance to the retractable or the detectable warning domes does not exceed 9 inches. Detectable warnings should be of a contrasting color. They should be in good condition. They should not be popped out like that. And this situation is a bad one for a variety of reasons. Number one, the dome should be placed 3 to 6 inches behind back of curb. And we try to keep our castings and grades outside of our pedestrian access route. Looks like they could have easily, well, we don't know, but possibly they could have shifted this curb opening so that that casting is not within it. A few other best practices. We want the domes to be within 3 inches of the edge of the sidewalk. We don't want any openings because we've put in rectangular domes where we should have used radial ones, which is funny because these look like radial ones, but they've left a little pie shape there, and that's not allowed. This is showing a slip ramp at a roundabout. I'm always at a loss for words as to what to cover here. Other than at the top, where the slip ramp tees into the trail, we put the domes at the top. And here it looks like we're directing pedestrians out onto an adjacent shoulder. We put the domes in the direction of travel. Again, this would be similar to that directional ramp that we covered before. Lastly, remember that the contractor does have a tolerance with finishing of 3/16 to 1/4 inch. So if that tolerance is going to send his slope out of tolerance for maximum slope, then that's a problem. So this looks to me like it's greater than 1/4 inch. But even if it wasn't, if placing my 2-foot level here means that I exceed a 2% grade, then that becomes problematic. Here we have bad finishing and that we have a hump in our ramp. This should be a continuous change in elevation from one point to another. Again, just showing that, I'm glad Todd's in the room. Todd, your name has come up when we show this slide. So this is showing that the tool joints on a concrete pavement must not exceed 1/2 inch. We see some cigarettes falling in there. It is preferred to saw the joints in the pedestrian access route, not tool them. Is that your message that you tell people? Or what would you say about that?
Yeah, you see cigarette butts in the joints, it's too big. But the spec has always said you could do 1/4 inch joints, 1/4 inch radius. So that way for many years, industry has not done it. They went to these big joints. So either tool them at the 1/4 inch, as the spec says, or saw cut.
So we've been using the word preferred to saw cut. Right? Wouldn't you say it's preferred?
Yep.
All right, and then just a little bit more about driveways. Remembering that I mentioned this before, driveways have a maximum grade as prescribed in the standard plans. That grade is 10% on a commercial driveway, 12% on a residential driveway, and that be this grade here. And then remember, we must maintain the 5-foot pedestrian access route through the driveway at a cross slope not exceeding 2%. Make sure that this kind of situation doesn't happen, that this ramp is not there. We don't want ramps into our driveways, that longitudinal grade does not exceed 5%. There are some details in the standard plan for working with back of curb height. So if you're trying to squeeze an inch out of a driveway, which sometimes could happen, you can use a different curb detail. Doorway landings, remember, I think I have a picture here. The doors should not protrude into the pedestrian access route. You may need to create this kind of frontage zone here, whether that's wide enough for both the door and the pedestrian access route. I guess the slide makes this, doesn't look like it is, but we hope that it is, because we can't be pushing people out into this area where we have a cross slope that exceeds 2%. Here's an example of a bad construction where this landing was placed at an elevation less than back of curb, causing water to drain this way and then that. That's not a good idea because number one, it pushes water onto the pedestrian access route. A better idea would be to use some of this elevation that they have here from the V curve, lift the whole landing, and force positive water flow out towards the gutter. Another example here, we see a bunch of flat slopes, but we have this vertical curb. If we were to lift this landing and put in some steeper slopes here, we might be able to eliminate the vertical curb. All right, I think I did okay in terms of time. So with that, we just want to remind you one last time that there is going to be a full construction class coming up in about a year. Todd, do we know if there's going to be certification that's attached to that?
MnDOT is doing separate certifications starting this winter, and we're at MnDOT certification. The state aid hasn't said they really hasn't chosen to go that way yet.
Okay.
From the local side.
So watch and learn. Again, you asked about mailing lists. I'm certain that if you guys, we talked to Mindy about getting a global mailing list together for this group because Brady and I have taught, well, I guess we'll be coming up to hundreds of people pretty soon by the time we're done this week. And we'll want to make sure you're informed of things. Plus, we'll be sending out that PDF once we get it all assembled. So with that, I tried to go kind of quick so that Brady would have a full 40 minutes to cover the last two sections. And if you feel like you need a break, feel free to do that, but we're not going to give you a formal break, okay? So with that, Brady, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Okay. So actually, these last two sections were closer to the end than you think. These last two have been taking about a half hour combined. So, as I mentioned, communication itself